Being a truck driver, you come across a lot of weird things on the road. Strange people, isolated places, and long stretches of highway where you can go hours without seeing another soul. But one trip, late last year, still sticks with me. It's the kind of memory that sits in the back of your mind like a bad dream, but you can't shake it no matter how hard you try. It was a routine long haul from Montana to Oregon, but it ended up being anything but ordinary. It started like any other drive. I had just loaded up my truck and hit the road around 4 p.m. The sky was a dull gray, and it looked like rain was coming in. It wasn't the best weather to drive in, but that wasn't unusual for this route. I was used to long, empty stretches of road through rural America, where the trees get thicker and the radio stations get fuzzier the deeper you go. Around 10 p.m., I found myself in one of those stretches of road that seemed to stretch out forever. The rain had started falling steadily, and the road ahead looked like an endless black ribbon disappearing into the mist. My headlights barely cut through the fog, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. My GPS suddenly flickered, recalculating the route. The screen went black for a moment before lighting up with a new direction. It wanted me to take a left turn onto a smaller road that wasn't originally part of my plan. At first, I ignored it, figuring it was just a glitch. The signal out here was spotty at best, but after a few more miles, the GPS became more insistent, beeping and recalculating every few minutes, always directing me to the same turn. Eventually, I started to get concerned. Maybe the highway ahead was closed or blocked, and I'd missed the signs. I was getting tired, and the rain made everything harder to judge. So when I saw the sign for a road turnoff about a mile ahead, I decided to trust the GPS and take the detour. The road I turned onto was narrow, barely wide enough for my rig, with thick trees lining both sides. The rain had turned the dirt road into a muddy mess, and I could feel the tires slipping slightly as I made my way down. My headlights lit up the trees in a creepy, almost unnatural way. Every few seconds I thought I saw movement, something darting between the trees, but it was always gone before I could focus. The further I drove, the more isolated I felt. My cell signal had dropped out, and the GPS was now completely useless, stuck on the same glitchy screen. I hadn't seen a single car, house, or even a sign of life for miles. Just darkness, rain, and endless forest. After about 30 minutes of driving down this eerie road, I began to regret taking the detour. I should have stayed on the highway. But I kept telling myself it was just a shortcut, and I'd be back on the main road soon. That's when I saw it, a gas station. At first I was relieved. It was a rundown, old-fashioned place with a single rusting gas pump and a flickering neon sign that said "Open" in bright red letters. The building itself was small, like one of those places you see in horror movies where something bad is about to happen. But I was running low on gas, and I figured I could ask someone for directions back to the main highway. I pulled my truck up to the pump and stepped out into the rain, pulling my jacket tight around me. The place looked deserted, but the lights were on, so I figured someone had to be inside. I walked to the door and pushed it open, a bell jingling as I stepped into the dimly lit interior. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Stale air mixed with gasoline and something else, something metallic and rotten. The inside was just as run down as the outside. There was an old counter with a cash register, a few dusty shelves filled with snacks and motor oil, and a refrigerator humming quietly in the corner. But what caught my attention was the man standing behind the counter. He was tall and thin, with deep-set eyes that didn't seem to blink. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his clothes looked old and worn like they hadn't been washed in years. He was just standing there, staring at me with a blank expression. Not saying a word, I cleared my throat, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. "Evening," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the silence. "Just need to fill up. Is there a restroom around?" The man didn't respond. He just kept staring, his eyes following me as I moved toward the counter. I felt a shiver run down my back, but I tried to ignore it. Okay, I mumbled. "I'll just go ahead and fill up then." I turned back to the door, but something stopped me in my tracks. A noise. A soft scraping sound like metal being dragged across concrete. I glanced around, trying to figure out where it was coming from. Then I saw it. Behind the counter, just barely visible through a doorway, was a dark figure. It was hunched over, and its long, spindly arms were dragging something heavy across the floor. My heart started to race. Something about the figure felt wrong, unnatural. I turned back to the man behind the counter, but his expression hadn't changed. He was still staring at me, unblinking as if he hadn't seen the figure at all. I backed away slowly, my instincts screaming at me to get out of there. "You know what?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll just head back to the road. Don't need the gas after all." I turned and walked out of the gas station as quickly as I could without running. The rain was coming down harder now, and I could barely see the outline of my truck through the downpour. I climbed into the cab, locked the doors, and took a deep breath, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. That's when I saw it. Standing at the edge of the forest, just beyond the glow of my headlights, was the figure from inside the gas station. It was tall and thin, with long limbs that didn't seem to move naturally. Its head was tilted to the side, and I could feel its eyes on me, watching. Without thinking, I started the engine and floored it, the tires spinning in the mud before finally catching traction. I sped down the narrow road, the rain blurring everything around me. My heart was pounding in my chest, and all I could think about was getting away from that place. But the road didn't end. I drove for what felt like hours, but the narrow, tree-lined road just kept going. No matter how far I drove, I couldn't find the highway. The gas station disappeared into the distance, but I felt like I was driving in circles, the same trees passing by over and over. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard, but it wasn't working. The radio was just static, and when I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw it again. The figure standing in the middle of the road behind me, getting closer. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I kept driving faster and faster, until finally I saw a light ahead. It was faint, but it was something. I pushed the truck harder, my foot heavy on the gas pedal. The light grew brighter, and I realized it was a pair of headlights, a car coming toward me. I honked the horn, flashing my lights, trying to get the driver's attention. As the car passed by, I saw the driver's face, a young woman staring straight ahead, her eyes wide with terror. She didn't look at me, didn't even acknowledge my truck. She just kept driving, disappearing into the night. I kept going, hoping I'd find another car, another sign of life. But the road stayed empty, and every time I looked in the rearview mirror, the figure was there, closer than before. I don't remember how I finally made it back to the highway. I must have driven all night, but eventually, the narrow road gave way to the familiar stretch of pavement, and the rain started to let up. I pulled into a rest stop, my hands still shaking, and sat there for a long time, just trying to make sense of what had happened. I never told anyone about that night. I'm not sure anyone would believe me. But I haven't taken a detour since, and every time I drive through the rain, I can't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure, watching me from the darkness. I've been a trucker for nearly 2 decades, and have seen my fair share of strange things on the road. I'm used to driving long stretches of highway in the dead of night, where the only company you have is the sound of your rig's engine and the distant hum of power lines. But there's one stretch of road I'll never forget, and I still think about it every time I pass through northern Nevada. It was late fall, and I was driving a route that took me through the desert, heading west to make a delivery in Reno. The trip had been uneventful until that point, just miles and miles of empty highway. I'd pulled an all-nighter, my eyes getting heavy, so I decided to take a break and catch some sleep at a rest stop near mile marker 237. I'd never stopped at this particular spot before. It wasn't much, just a small gravel lot with a couple of picnic tables and a single streetlight flickering on and off. But it was quiet, and that's all I needed. I pulled my rig into the lot, parked under the light, and leaned back in my seat, ready for a quick nap. As I started to doze off, I heard something. A faint scratching sound coming from the back of my truck. At first, I thought it might have been a branch or a piece of debris blown by the wind, but the sound was rhythmic, persistent, like something, or someone, was tapping on the trailer. My first thought was that someone was messing with my load. It wouldn't be the first time someone tried to break into a trailer at a rest stop. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed out of the cab, the cold desert air biting my skin. I walked around to the back of the trailer, shining the light along the edges, but there was nothing there. No sign of anyone, no footprints in the gravel, nothing out of place. I chalked it up to exhaustion and went back to the cab. But as soon as I sat down, the scratching started again, this time louder. My pulse quickened. I knew I wasn't imagining it. I grabbed my flashlight again and stepped out, determined to find the source of the noise. That's when I saw it. In the distance, near the edge of the rest stop, there was a figure standing by the side of the road, just barely visible in the faint light from the street lamp. It was hard to make out any details, but they were tall and thin, their posture unnaturally rigid. They didn't move, didn't acknowledge me, just stood there, staring in my direction. I called out, "Hey, you need something?" But there was no response. I felt a chill run down my spine, and the desert air suddenly seemed even colder. I turned to get back into the cab, but when I looked back, the figure was gone. I scanned the area with my flashlight, but it was as if they'd vanished into thin air. I locked the doors and started the engine, ready to get the hell out of there. As the headlights illuminated the road ahead, I saw something on the asphalt. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I drove closer, I realized it was a series of deep, dark gouges in the road, like claw marks, stretching across the highway for several feet. My heart pounded in my chest as I sped past the marks. I couldn't explain them, and I didn't want to stick around long enough to figure it out. I drove for another hour, the eerie feeling lingering long after I'd left the rest stop behind. But the worst part came later. I made it to Reno without any more incidents and delivered my load as scheduled. It wasn't until I was getting ready to head back that I noticed something strange. The back of my trailer, near the doors, was covered in deep scratches, similar to the ones I'd seen on the road. They were long and jagged, as if something had tried to tear its way into the trailer. I knew those scratches hadn't been there before. I checked my truck religiously before every trip, and there's no way I would have missed something like that. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my hands shook as I inspected the damage. I asked around the truck stop, but no one had seen anything strange that night. One guy, an older trucker who'd been driving the same route for years, gave me a knowing look when I mentioned the rest stop at mile marker 237. "You saw it, didn't you?" he said quietly. "Saw what?" I asked, confused. "The thing that haunts that stretch of road. I've heard stories about it for years, but I never thought anyone would see it. Some kind of spirit or demon, they say, shows up to drivers who stop there at night, marks their trailers, follows them for miles." I tried to laugh it off, but there was something in his eyes that told me he wasn't joking. He went on to explain that several truckers had reported similar experiences, seeing a figure near the road, hearing strange noises, finding their trucks damaged afterward. No one knew exactly what it was, but everyone who'd encountered it said the same thing. They never stopped there again. I didn't need to be told twice. To this day, I avoid mile marker 237 like the plague. I've driven past it a few times since then, but I've never stopped. Whenever I pass by, I keep my eyes on the road and my foot on the gas, refusing to look toward the rest stop. I don't know what I saw that night, but I'm not interested in finding out. Some things on the road can't be explained, and some places are better left alone. Mile marker 237 is one of those places. My name is Jake, and I've been a trucker for over 15 years. I've seen my share of strange things on the road. Deer jumping out of nowhere, bizarre accidents, even a tornado once, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened on a cold November night deep in the back roads of West Virginia. I had just picked up a load in Baltimore, headed to a distribution center in Kentucky. The route took me through the Appalachian Mountains, a stretch I knew well. The drive was beautiful but desolate, with winding roads that could be treacherous in bad weather. That night, it was especially dark, with heavy clouds blotting out the moon and only my headlights to cut through the inky blackness. I was making good time, my CB radio playing some classic rock to keep me awake. The route was familiar, and I was comfortable, despite the isolation. There wasn't another vehicle in sight, and I hadn't seen a gas station or rest stop for miles. It was just me, my rig, and the endless ribbon of asphalt stretching into the dark. After a while, I noticed something strange in the distance. A light, faint but growing stronger as I got closer. At first I thought it might be another truck, but the light wasn't right. It was too high up and flickered in a way that headlights don't. Curiosity got the better of me, so I kept my eyes on it, trying to figure out what it could be. As I rounded a bend, the light became clearer, and I realized it was a lantern, the old-fashioned kind, swinging slowly back and forth. And below it, barely illuminated by the dim glow, was a figure standing at the side of the road. They were dressed in what looked like old, tattered clothes, a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured their face. My first thought was that it was some hitchhiker, maybe a local who'd run into car trouble. But something about them didn't sit right with me. They were completely still, not waving or signaling for help, just standing there with that lantern, watching as I approached. I slowed down, unsure of what to do. I'm not one to pick up hitchhikers. Too many horror stories, too many risks. But I couldn't just leave them out there in the middle of nowhere. As I got closer, I got a better look at the figure. Something was off. Their clothes were wrong, like something out of a different time, and the way they stood, so still and rigid, sent a shiver down my spine. When I was about 50 feet away, they finally moved. They turned their head toward me, and I could just make out their face under the hat's brim. It was pale, almost unnaturally so, and their eyes, there was something wrong with their eyes. They were too dark, like two empty voids staring right through me. My gut told me to keep driving, to get the hell out of there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that if I drove past, something bad would happen. But I wasn't about to stop and invite trouble, so I did the next best thing. I rolled down my window just a crack as I slowed down to a crawl. "Need some help?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. The figure didn't respond at first, just stood there, lantern swaying in the cold night air. Then, slowly, they pointed down the road, in the direction I was heading. "Danger ahead," the figure said in a low, raspy voice that didn't sound quite human. "Turn back." The words sent a chill down my spine, and every instinct screamed at me to listen. But this was the only road through the mountains that could handle my rig, and there was no way I was turning back and adding hours to my drive without a good reason. "Thanks, but I'll take my chances," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The figure didn't move, didn't say another word. They just kept pointing down the road, their eyes locked onto mine. I rolled up the window, shifted back into gear, and slowly pulled away, my heart pounding in my chest. As I drove off, I checked my mirrors, expecting to see the figure recede into the darkness. But they didn't. They were still there, standing in the middle of the road, lantern swinging back and forth, watching me until they disappeared from sight. For a while, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my gut. I kept expecting something to jump out of the shadows, or for the road to suddenly end in a sheer drop. But the miles ticked by, and nothing happened. No more figures, no strange lights, just the dark road ahead. Eventually I began to relax, convincing myself that it was just some weirdo trying to scare me. Maybe it was a prank, or maybe they were just crazy. Either way, I was glad to be rid of them. But that relief was short-lived. About 20 minutes later, I noticed something strange. The air seemed to get colder, and a thick fog began to roll in, obscuring the road ahead. It was sudden, like flipping a switch, and within moments, I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. I slowed down, squinting through the windshield, trying to make out the road, and then I saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road, right in my path. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as my rig came to a halt just feet away from the figure. My heart was in my throat as I realized who it was. It was the same figure from before. The same clothes, the same lantern, the same dark, empty eyes. But this time, they were closer. Close enough that I could see the details of their face. It was gaunt, almost skeletal, and their skin had a sickly grayish hue. They didn't say anything, didn't move, just stood there, watching me with those hollow eyes. I sat there frozen, not sure what to do. This wasn't possible. I'd left them miles back, on the other side of the mountain. There was no way they could have gotten ahead of me. No way they could be here now. Finally, I snapped out of it. I didn't care if it was a ghost, a trick of the mind, or some kind of elaborate prank. I wasn't sticking around to find out. I threw the rig into reverse, my eyes never leaving the figure as I backed away slowly. But as soon as I started moving, the figure took a step forward, and then another. They were following me, matching my speed, their lanterns swinging with each step. My blood ran cold as I realized they weren't going to stop. I floored it, the truck lurching as I sped backward, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. But the fog was thick, and I could barely see where I was going. I glanced in the mirrors, desperate for some kind of escape, when I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was another figure behind me, just like the first one, identical in every way, standing in the road, waiting for me to back into them. I was trapped. Panic took over, and I did the only thing I could think of. I turned the wheel hard and spun the rig around, tires screeching as I did a full 180. I didn't care if the road was clear or if I crashed. I just needed to get out of there. I floored it, speeding back down the road the way I'd come, the fog closing in around me. The figures were gone, but I didn't dare look back. I drove like a man possessed, gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. It wasn't until I was miles away, the fog finally thinning and the road straightening out, that I dared to breathe again. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands shaking, and tried to calm down. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But there was no making sense of it. It didn't matter how hard I tried to rationalize it. There was no explanation for what I'd seen. I was a seasoned trucker. I'd seen strange things before, but nothing like this. I sat there for a long time, engine idling, staring out into the night. I wanted to believe it was over, that I'd left whatever that was behind. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I knew that whatever it wasn't bound by the rules of the road or the limits of distance. I knew that it could find me again. Eventually, I got back on the road, my eyes darting to the mirrors every few seconds, my nerves on edge. The rest of the drive was uneventful, but I didn't relax until I saw the lights of the distribution center in the distance. When I finally arrived, I parked the rig, climbed out, and swore to myself that I'd never take that route again. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. Who would believe me? But I knew that I'd never forget that night. Those empty eyes, that cold, sickly face, the way they seemed to know exactly where I was going to be. Even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, waiting for me to drive that road again. Waiting for me to slip up, to make a wrong turn, to find myself alone in the dark. And when that happens, I don't think I'll be so lucky next time. I've been driving trucks for nearly 20 years. And I've seen just about everything the road can throw at you. Drunken drivers, freak snowstorms, a man walking down the middle of the highway at 3 a.m. in nothing but his underwear. You name it, I've seen it. But nothing compares to what happened to me last fall on a lonely stretch of Route 50 in Nevada, a place known to locals as the loneliest road in America. It was late October, and I was hauling a load of auto parts from Carson City to Ely. The trip started like any other. A clear night, my CB buzzing with chatter from other truckers and the monotony of the road stretching out before me. Route 50 is infamous for its desolation. No towns, no gas stations, just miles and miles of empty road flanked by barren desert. I was about halfway through my drive, the clock nearing 2 a.m., when I noticed something strange. My headlights picked up a glint of something in the distance. At first I thought it might be an animal, maybe a coyote or a deer. But as I got closer, I realized it was a car pulled off to the side of the road, its hazard lights blinking dimly. There was something off about it, though. The car, a beat-up old sedan, wasn't just parked on the shoulder. It was at a weird angle as it had swerved off the road. The driver's door was wide open, swinging slightly in the breeze. I slowed down as I approached, peering into the darkness to see if I could spot anyone. It's not uncommon for drivers to break down out here, and usually they'd be flagging down the first vehicle they saw. But there was no one around, just the open door and those dim, blinking lights. A little voice in the back of my head told me to keep driving. Something about the scene didn't sit right with me. But the Good Samaritan in me couldn't just leave someone stranded, so I decided to stop and check it out. I pulled my rig to the side of the road, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped out into the cold night air. "Hello?" I called out as I approached the car, my voice echoing in the emptiness. No response. The car was in bad shape, dents all over, a cracked windshield, and a thick layer of dust caked on the sides. The inside was worse, with trash and fast food wrappers littering the floor and seats, but there was no sign of the driver. I walked around to the front of the car, shining my flashlight into the darkness and scanning the surrounding desert. Nothing, just the faint howl of the wind and the distant sound of my truck's engine idling. As I turned back to the car, something caught my eye. In the back seat, barely visible through the dirty windows, was a shape, slumped over, motionless. "Hey, are you okay?" I called out again, stepping closer. Still no response. I reached for the door handle, hesitating for a moment before pulling it open. The smell hit me first, stale sweat and something else, something metallic. My heart skipped a beat as I realized what I was looking at. The figure in the back seat was a man, middle-aged, with a graying beard and a faded flannel shirt. But he wasn't just asleep or unconscious. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly ahead, and his throat had been slashed open, blood soaking his shirt and pooling on the seat. I staggered back, bile rising in my throat. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This wasn't just a breakdown. This was a crime scene. I had to call the police. I turned and sprinted back to my truck, my heart pounding in my chest. But as I reached the door, I heard something, a faint rustling sound coming from the direction of the car. I froze, my hand hovering over the door handle. The rustling grew louder, more deliberate, like footsteps on gravel. I slowly turned my head, my eyes scanning the darkness. There, just beyond the reach of my headlights, was a figure, a man, tall and thin, dressed in dark clothes. He was standing perfectly still, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. His face was obscured by the shadow of his hat, but I could feel his gaze boring into me. For a moment, we just stood there staring at each other. Then, without a word, the man turned and walked back toward the car, disappearing into the darkness. My heart raced as I fumbled with the door handle, desperate to get back inside my truck. I jumped into the cab, slammed the door shut, and locked it. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my eyes darting between the rearview mirrors, half expecting the man to appear out of the darkness at any moment. The dispatcher answered, her voice calm and professional, but I could barely form words. I managed to give her my location and explain what I'd found, all while keeping an eye on the road behind me. "Stay in your vehicle," she instructed. "Officers are on their way. They'll be there in about 20 minutes. 20 minutes. It felt like an eternity. I hung up and started the engine, keeping my headlights on the car in front of me. The seconds ticked by painfully slowly, each one filled with dread. I could still see the car, its hazard lights blinking, but there was no sign of the man. Then something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. Movement. Just a flicker, but enough to send my heart racing. I adjusted the mirror, my breath catching in my throat as I realized what I was seeing. The man was standing behind my truck, his face still obscured by the shadow of his hat. He was closer now, only about 10 feet away, just standing there staring at me. I could feel the sweat beating on my forehead as I reached for the gear shift. I had to get out of there. I didn't care about waiting for the police anymore. Whatever this guy wanted, I wasn't sticking around to find out. But as I moved to shift into drive, something stopped me. A sound, soft at first, almost like a whisper, coming from the back of the cab. I froze, my hand hovering over the gear shift, listening intently. The whisper grew louder, more distinct, and then I realized it wasn't a whisper at all. It was breathing, slow, raspy breathing, coming from right behind me. I turned slowly, my heart hammering in my chest, and looked into the sleeper compartment at the back of the cab. The light from the dashboard barely reached that far, but I could just make out a shape. Something hunched over, moving slightly in the darkness. The breath caught in my throat as the shape shifted, and I saw it. A pair of eyes, wide and bloodshot, staring back at me from the shadows. The man, the same one from the car, was in my truck, crouched in the sleeper compartment, watching me. I didn't think, I just acted. I threw the truck into gear and floored it, the tires screeching as I tore down the road. The man in the back seat let out a low, guttural growl, and I could hear him scrambling toward me, his hands reaching out for the back of the driver's seat. But I didn't stop. I didn't even look back. I drove like a man possessed, my knuckles white as I gripped the wheel, praying that I could outrun him, that I could get to safety before he got to me. The police found me about 10 miles down the road, my truck idling on the shoulder with the doors locked and my phone clutched in my hand. The man was gone, but the blood stains in the sleeper compartment were proof enough that I hadn't imagined it. They searched the area, combing the desert for any sign of him, but he was never found. The only clue was the abandoned car and the body in the back seat, a victim of a crime that would never be solved. I never drove that route again, and I never picked up another hitchhiker. But every time I get behind the wheel, I can't help but glance in the mirrors, half expecting to see those bloodshot eyes staring back at me. And every night, when I close my eyes, I can still hear that raspy breathing, still feel the terror of knowing that something was in the truck with me, something that wanted me dead.